start our second panel, which is on broken windows policing and whether it works. For those of you who aren't familiar with broken windows policing, it is a theory that posits that if you go after low-level offenses, you will kind of see more community order, and you will see less violent crime and less serious crime by aggressively enforcing low-level violations. It was originally espoused by a man named George Kelling and Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, who recently stepped down as the commissioner of the NYPD, was a very strong proponent of this. For the affirmative, we have Michael Jenkins, who is a professor at the University of Scranton, and for the negative, we have Tina Luongo, who is the attorney in charge of the criminal practice at Legal Aid. Michael.
Okay, thank you. It's an honor to be here tonight at NYU as part of this debate, and I think as you'll notice throughout the evening, I may seem a little dispassionate when it comes to my explanation in defense of broken windows, but I do believe that these are important conversations to have so that we can get broken windows policing right. We've all experienced it. Some of us live it. Being in a place surrounded by abandoned properties with broken windows and blanketed and graffiti, sidewalks where used condoms, heroin baggies, needles, and other trash litters the ground. Groups of people using menacing words and threatening actions aimed at passersby. One could almost forget the legitimate purposes for these public spaces, to allow the safe and orderly movement of people interested in partaking in their community life, free from fear and guarded against victimization. And yet, even more harmful than discouraging the legitimate reasons for our public spaces is the fact that these neighborhood conditions encourage the deviant and violent behavior that undermines the quality of life of the many law-abiding people who live there. Tonight, I'll share some evidence-based conclusions about disorder, fear, and crime. I'll show that disorder is a top-ranking concern for residents, even in the most violence-prone areas. And we'll see that broken windows policing, that is, police caring about disorder, is necessary for ensuring that everyone has equal access to the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. The connection between fear, disorder, and crime makes sense intuitively. There's also much research to support it. Zimbardo's Palo Alto Bronx study, Wes Scogan's tome on the spiral of decay, and the more recent experimental results from the Netherlands, which showed lower-level disorder leads to more serious disorder and crime. Across socioeconomic, geographic, and racial lines, disorder is frequently a top concern for people. For example, in a study of problems facing Boston residents, the top 5 most serious problems were: number 1, litter and trash; number 2, cars broken into; 3, drug sales; 4, burglary; and 5, vandalism. 4 of the top 5 are clearly related to respondents' perceptions of physical and social disorder. Scogan reports Chicagoans in 2009 called their emergency telephone center 264,000 times about issues of disorder. Neighborhoods characterized by concentrations of physical and social disorder are often the locus of many of society's failings: education, healthcare, economic, and employment sectors. This disorder, then, serves as an additional, in-your-face, daily destruction of one's communal identity. Police often serve as the only line of defense, the only response that many communities have for dealing with the symptoms of these problems. When people cry for government to do something about the disorder and crime affecting their neighborhoods, it's the police who show up. The police, for better or worse, have adopted a you call and we come mentality. They assist communities in meeting whatever needs they have. It's for that reason that I think that good policing, including policing disorder, encourages faith and legitimacy in criminal justice and government institutions, and most importantly, saves lives. There are many examples of broken windows policing at work: the New York subways in the 1980s, Bryant Park in the early 1990s, Manhattan in the mid-1990s, LA's MacArthur Park in 2003, and Skid Row just about 10 years ago. Broken windows policing works. Of course, we're all familiar with the often cited contribution of broken windows policing in 1990s New York City, namely that the application of broken windows policing within a larger community-based, data-driven strategy resulted in murders being reduced from 1,600 a year to around 400 a year. Literally thousands of lives saved. However, more reliable studies of broken windows policing specifically credit the approach to preventing 60,000 violent crimes in the 10-year period from 1989 to 1998. The most convincing research on the efficacy of broken windows policing comes from a 2015 systematic review and meta-analysis of 30 experimental and quasi-experimental studies of the approach. The study concluded an overall statistically significant effect on crime reduction, with the strongest effect sizes coming from those applications that were part of a community problem-solving focus. In the 30 included studies, the law enforcement function of police, such as arrest and citation, was used in only 10. The remaining 20 experiments examined community-based problem-oriented disorder reduction activities by police. On an even more promising note, in New York City, which put broken windows policing on the international stage, a 2013 Vera Institute report found from 1985 to 2009, when arrests for misdemeanor offenses were at their highest, the total number of people in jail, prison, or on probation and parole dropped markedly. The report concludes, quote, "The broken windows policy reduced the entire correctional population of the state. As a result, New York City was responsible for an overall reduction in New York State's incarceration rate, and, but for the 1994 crime bill, which incentivized states to increase prison sentences, the reduction would have been even more drastic." The NYPD OIG report that was hailed by critics of broken windows policing acknowledged that low-level summonses address community concerns. The report suggested that when controlling for instances of violent crime, the NYPD did not enforce quality of life disproportionately against Black and Hispanic individuals. All individuals have the right to basic quality of life, free from intimidation, harassment, and violence. I believe that for this reason, when police use broken windows policing, that is, pay attention to disorderly conditions, that they improve the quality of life, ensure that all people enjoy equal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So I'm the attorney in charge of the Legal Aid Society's criminal practice, and what that means is I started my career as a public defender in Manhattan and have served in the capacity of representing and now sort of supervising the entire public defense operation. And while Mr. Jenkins sort of lays out sort of the theoretical approach, what is gapingly missing from both his sort of explanation of what Broken Windows is doing and sort of what I think NYPD's sort of failure to recognize is that it has unbelievably crippled communities of color. There was no conversation whatsoever that NYPD has only focused their approach in Broken Windows in the disorder that happens in low-income communities of color. And as a public defender who represented in my career, and certainly all of the defenders that represent over 200,000 New Yorkers charged with both misdemeanor violations and felonies, I'm going to tell you that Broken Windows has created an unbelievable problem, not only here in New York City, but across the jurisdictions it has been put in place. Now, we can cite a lot of sort of statistics about how the correlation between arresting somebody for loitering or trespass, normally young Black or Latino boys or young women, helps somehow reduce violent crime. And there are lots of talk about sort of these researches that show that has to be the correlation. The reality is, for decades, violent crime has actually been on a systematic decline in every jurisdiction, whether you implemented Broken Windows or not. And people are struggling with why that might be. But certainly, what we have to see is, even if the presumption was right, even if Kelling and proponents such as Mr. Jenkins would be correct in their assumption that somehow if you swept up somebody with a squeegee in a window, you were going to prevent a rape. The fact is, you have this other problem, and that is you have a police force that has been militarized, that has been not trained, not accountable, no transparency, going around and using sort of this vague policy that talks about how you have to implement policies to get rid of disorder. So think about that for a moment. Think about what an officer's presumption of disorder is in East New York or Crown Heights or Hunts Point versus the same officer's perception of what disorder is in Park Slope, in the Upper West Side. The fact that we use this vague terminology, that what broken windows should do is get rid of the disorder so that other people feel confident and use the police to actually define what that is, has caused us the death of Eric Garner, the death of young boys of color and across this country. And it has created a crisis right now where communities, even if police officers are going into communities with the best intentions, have crippled the relationship between that police and between the communities. Also that we can implement a policy that sort of goes like this. If there is a broken window in a community, if you leave it broken, other windows will become broken. So fix the broken window. Don't militarize with police. That's the problem. And in fact, the gentleman who created this sort of policy, after the death of Eric Garner, published in the Daily News in 2015 a retrenchment and said, actually, I have to get to it, never meant to be a high arrest program, proactive and practiced, never conceived it to be in those terms. We need social workers, city code enforcer, BIDs, business improvement districts, teachers, medical, clergy, and others as part of the response to a broken window. Arrest of an offender is supposed to be the last resort. And I'm going to tell you, in every single day since broken windows, both Bratton Time 1 and Bratton Time 2 here in New York City, all we saw as public defenders were young people of color mostly, or homeless people dragged through our courts on low-level offenses for simply being not orderly enough. The other notion I sort of want to deal with is actually it's NYPD's own data. So the idea would be that if you as police department, you would respond to these sort of broken window complaints or disorder complaints. NYPD shows that actually the areas that had the highest concentration of 911 and 311 calls were Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, Brooklyn Heights, Financial District, Murray Hill, Upper East Side, Upper West Side. They put on the same map the areas of highest concentration of C summonses, which are the sort of tickets that get written or then an arrest. Want to guess that that was not actually where they placed their policing strategies, that instead the map showed anything but. It was Brownsville. It was East New York. It was Hunts Point. It was areas in which there were high concentrations of people of color and poor people of color.
Okay, Michael, if you have a couple questions for Tina.
Questions or comments? Rebut.
Both.
It's
Okay.
cross-examination.
So the intention is for you to cross-examine her.
The evidence is clear that while there may be these other unintended consequences of the limited definition of broken windows policing as being arrests and citations of individuals, the evidence is clear that police, the NYPD in New York specifically, have been responsible for saving lives and reducing overall violence in the past 20 years. And I guess I would ask, what role do you think that police should play in continuing to combat the awful violence that many people still experience on a regular basis in New York City?
So police departments have a very specific function, and that is to address public safety and significant public safety issues. Nobody is saying that they should not exist. I'm a public defender. I wouldn't say that they shouldn't exist. But they must exist for that purpose. When we start to talk about the things, I'm going to give you an example of a lawsuit. So we had a lawsuit. It was called our Davis case. It was around the same time we mounted a case. Many of you know the stop and frisk case. It was around the same time, but this is what our case was. We saw through the representation of people in courts that over and over again, we would hear, in terms of trespass arrests, clients would say, I was in my grandmother's building, or I was in my own building, or I was going to visit my friend, and I got arrested for trespass. And when we would go and send our investigators out, we'd knock on doors, and a grandmother would come to the door and say, yeah, my grandson was arrested on his way to me. Or my friend who was bringing me milk because I just had surgery. Or yes, he was arrested, but he was arrested on the landing on the way to the roof. And so our investigation into this and the depositions that sort of led from this told a story that I think paints an exact picture of what you really should do when even a building sort of has complaints. So these were NYCHA buildings, and they were complaints.
I just want to interject for those who don't know, NYCHA is the New York City Housing Authority. It's public housing in New York.
So residents would complain to police departments that the lights were out in their stairwells, the intercom systems weren't working, the locks would often be broken. So the answer to that was to issue a sort of policy called vertical patrols. So police would sweep into a building, start at the roof, and go everywhere down, and they'd arrest every single person that they thought was trespassing. I want you to picture what the ancillary to that is in a Upper West Side building. So an Upper West Side building, the lock is broken, you call your landlord, and they fix the lock. You call and say, my intercom isn't working, your landlord fixes the lock. Maybe you even have a concern about security. So your landlord hires a private security company. Your landlord on the Upper West Side would not pay NYPD under a memorandum of understanding millions of dollars to come in and sweep from from the top of your roof down to your basement and arrest people that were in your building that didn't have the right ID. So the bottom line is this: if we really want to believe that broken windows policy should be working, then here's what we suggested in our lawsuit. Stop vertical patrols. Fix the intercoms, fix the lighting issues, and put in a private security company, and maybe you can actually hire people for jobs and do that instead of militarizing and over-policing because you have taken a patronizing approach to safety. So my answer to you about sort of what we should do about NYPD, I think it's sort of an extreme, right? I'm not saying get rid of NYPD, and I'm certainly not saying that they're not going to arrest people for violent crimes, nor if, by the way, they should have probable cause to do so, but when they do, that's their job, and it's our job as public defenders to defend those people. But to arrest people for low-level stuff, thinking that somehow that is going to prevent serious crime from happening, is actually actually it's been disproven. And I can go on and talk about sort of the research that recently has happened from the Department of Investigations on actually the summons reduction versus violent crime.
You can go on, but that will have to wait for later.
We could wait.
This is actually your chance to ask Michael.
No, it's
question.
Michael.
Oh,
It's Michael, sorry.
it still is.
Mhm.
Sorry.
I think that there's a definitional issue with broken windows policing being associated with simply making arrests for issues of disorder. And I think that a lot of the research and a lot of the implementation of broken windows policing has included a lot more community problem-solving types of experiences where the police are working with the community to respond to not just issues of apartments not having lights, but issues of that I think we'd all agree are serious issues that need attending to, such as individuals harassing people, threatening them when they're coming into their own home. Individuals who are trying to shake down people who are in a certain area and asking them for money and using, intimidation against those individuals. And again, I agree that the arrest function of police has been overused. I disagree that it's been. I disagree that this conversation should be about the militarization of police, because that is different from police attention to broken windows, to disorder. And so again, when community members call and say, I'm upset about people who are harassing me in the streets. I'm upset about the potential for, my business keeps getting graffitied over. What is the police response to that?
So I thought San Diego had actually really good approach to sort of really problem solving that doesn't include arresting. So they had a series of robberies that happened near a bus station that was not very well lit. So they moved the bus station to where it was well lit, and the robbery stopped. And I sort of think, look, there's two different things here, right? You really have to look at the root causes of why somebody might be begging, and that you call it shaking down, I call it begging. That's because we have over 60,000 homeless people in the city. We just heard about some of the sort of things that people resort to in order to sort of make way when they don't have resources. Graffiti, before legal aid, I worked with kids in gang intervention prevention, and one of the by and large problems with the influx of gangs was the reduction our school systems had in after school programs. So, you have to really go to the root causes, and we're never really going to have a reform effort if all we think the reform is providing more police to do, frankly, what we should be doing on the front end of things, fixing homelessness, looking at engagement of young people in proactive approaches like Cure Violence, where the model is working with community members not to arrest people but to engage them in their own problem solving. I think what is missing from these real reform efforts is real conversations about what people in these communities actually think are going to be helpful. Now, we have some hope in that tenants associations should be sort of revitalized and funded, because tenants associations are really critical, and partnering with them in a real way to look at the issues that cause the harassing issues. But to simply say what we should do is arrest the person, because I'm going to tell you what happens in the criminal justice system.
I'm not arguing that at all, for the record.
Right. So, I think the problem is that New York City's approach to this, perhaps as a philosophical theory, this may work if you sort of can get a police department to not rely on arresting and not have implicit bias as to how you define disorderly.
And you gave excellent examples of that.
The problem is we haven't done that here in New York City, and it has crippled us. It hasn't really, in sort of, I believe, at this. Now, we also have a problem at the same time that this is happening, and we are looking at changing and reforming sort of years of broken windows policing. We have an enormous amount of police to civilian death and injury. Mm-hmm. And I am not saying that the corollary is broken windows and Eric Garner's murder or any other murder. I'm not saying that. But I am saying it complicates it. Because now you have a level of distrust that even with police officers with good intentions, going into communities, people are afraid, like literally for life. So the intersection of this, plus the fact that here in New York City, we have not actually disciplined police officers for things like killing Eric Garner. And that death was tied to a low level, what would be a quality of life arrest for selling a Lucy cigarette. You have these two moments where lack of accountability and over-policing on low-level things came together in a very disastrous way, particularly for Mr. Garner. But now it really requires you to undo and do away with broken windows and increase accountability and transparency in order to have real community reform around policing and engagement.
I would argue in terms of the Eric Garner case, I think that is actually a perfect example of this disconnect that I'm trying to present. And that is that the Eric Garner case, the police were there because of community complaints about a guy selling Lucy cigarettes and intimidating them when they were going inside and outside of the local business. The business store also complained about Eric Garner. I think it's a perfect example of showing how the arrest and force function of the police went wrong. I think, though, it's also a perfect example of why we need police to still attend to that problem that was a very serious problem in that community, right? You might not think it's a serious problem. From what I can understand, based on citizen complaints to the police about that problem, it was a problem for that community. Police, if they were including a community problem-solving strategy, they would have known, Eric Garner was arrested 30 times prior to that incident. I'm sure, I bet my right leg, that there were numbers of complaints prior to that deadly interaction. If police were engaged in a problem-solving approach that was in touch with the community, they would have been able to do exactly what we're talking about in terms of engaging other non-law enforcement means of preventing that problem from arising. And which is why I'm saying I agree with you that police should not rely on the arrest function when it comes to issues of disorder, but would you agree with me that police can play a central role in attending to disorder in other non-law enforcement ways, such as the examples that you gave in San Diego and in New York?
I'm not necessarily sure that the police generated the reform effort in San Diego because it had to do with sort of the city planning function of moving the bus stop. So it's the MTA, I'm not at all disagreeing that what is needed is real community policing. I just don't think, right now we have the leadership to get there, and I think the damage sort of has been done that even with the right leadership and the right model, we are ways away from building that trust. Because, look, I'm a public defender. I actually think Eric Garner shouldn't have been arrested for selling a Lucy cigarette. It is by definition whose complaint. So it was the store owner who was losing money on taxed cigarettes. He was selling it to people who have limited means, who are addicted to tobacco smoke. We can go there about how that happened, and who don't have, what is it now, $11, $12 a pack? I don't even know, but it's astronomical. So that's the way he made his living to support a family. Had he been robbing somebody, we'd have a bigger problem. He was trying to make do. And I think, though, what happens is, here we are, with privilege, many of us white, sort of looking down, and that's certainly Daniel Pantaleo, the cop who put the chokehold on him, was looking at him in that way, in a biased sort of way in which he had to be taken down. It was a cigarette. So let's put that in perspective. And that's where I say we have a problem. So you have a vague policy that calls for you to police disorder. You have the bias, and I don't know how many people have watched 13th recently, and I raised this only because I just watched it with my wife. And I've been doing this work a really long time, and I have to sit here and I had to sort of be speechless about even the stuff that I did not know about the level of racism and criminalization that has started from the 13th Amendment on. And so it's not a wonder that we've gotten here where you have these vague laws and then we allowed just too much discretion, and some discretion in policing has to happen. You can't have a street encounter without that. But you do have a police force that has been not so trained, not so transparent, and not so accountability. And racism does play a role, because what we have said is you have to go into these communities and you have to make these arrests and you have to have quotas, right? And so it became a cycle that led to this. And what I'm saying to, I guess, you, and what I would sort of say right now in terms of healing from this is the broken windows is broken. I don't think you philosophically have a viable theory anymore, because you don't have the benefit anymore of anybody feeling confident that this is an approach that would in any way work, particularly now. So that's sort of why I think you can't rely on policing for conditions like that any longer. It's too deadly for some, and it's too costly for others.
So quickly, just to the audience, I appreciate that you're engaged, and we will have time for your questions, but please hold your responses and affirmations until then. And Michael, you now have 4 minutes for kind of a crystallization of your argument.
Okay, I would just argue, first of all, part of the issue that we see in policing today, when it comes to the response of police to lower level offenses, is that they've actually not been given the tools necessary to use their discretion in ways that would make them think that they could do something other than arrest or cite someone. So again, I'm in agreement that the focus on arrests and citations for lower level offenses is no longer beneficial to communities. It may be beneficial in very limited contexts to respond to certain problems, but it is not generally what broken windows policing is or should be. If you go back to the 1982 article in which Kelly and Wilson posited this connection, they mention arrest and citation very little. And the few times that they do mention it, they mention it in regards to moving away from having to arrest or cite. In fact, they talk about communities taking responsibility amongst themselves for the behaviors of their fellow citizens and how police could help enforce those social norms within neighborhoods. So broken windows policing, to me, and I think the reason why I'm here arguing for it, is that we could talk about police having to respond to root causes. And so we know, if you took Criminology 101, we know all the causes of criminality. For police, it may not matter, because they're called to respond to events that are occurring in communities. And while many of their interactions with citizens are proactive, that is, police initiated, most interactions that occur between police and citizens are a result of citizens saying, hey, help me, there's a problem. And so if we don't acknowledge that reality, that communities are calling upon police to help them respond to these issues, then I think we're doing our communities a great disservice. And as I mentioned, and as it's come up already, it's these same communities that are already suffering from the social ills of unemployment, undereducation, et cetera, that are in most need of some source of legitimacy to help them take care of their issues. And I don't think that the police primarily should be in there for arrest purposes, but I think they can play a very vital role in ensuring that there's someone there on their side. That there's a champion there who said, here's my cell phone number as your patrol officer. I'm going to make sure that we get the appropriate city agency in here to help you take care of this. Or in the case of Eric Gardner, again, an awful case in terms of the way the NYPD responded in that situation. But a better approach would be not for police to turn a blind eye to that situation, which you have an upset business owner complaining about a guy, or you might have customers complaining about that man. Because what do you think might happen there? Do you think maybe some violence might erupt if the store owner confronts that individual and says, hey, why don't you move along and not sell these cigarettes in front of my store, right? It could very easily, I think very realistically, we could think that that might erupt in a more violent event. And so we want police to respond when community members complain about these low-level offenses, because those low-level offenses detract and take away from the quality of life of all individuals. You know, I think many of us probably live in pretty decent neighborhoods where, because of the neighborhoods we live in and because of the different relationships we have with people in those neighborhoods, we live pretty safe, law-abiding, and lives free from fear. There are many people in neighborhoods in New York City where they don't have that privilege. And it's the police, for better or worse, who are the ones who are called to help and to respond in those situations. So sure, there are ways that we could make policing better, we need to, but I think that to say police should not respond to disorder, which is the basis of broken windows policing, I think it would be further detrimental to our communities.
Tina, would you like to crystallize your argument and rebut that?
Sure. So I think that the problem is in and of itself sort of this focus on broken windows as opposed to focusing on community policing. And I actually think, and I sort of think that you also have thought, it's two separate things that sort of unfortunately get sort of mixed together. So I live in Red Hook, and there's a Red Hook Community Court, and it works really well. It's one court, it's local, Red Hook, Brooklyn, right? So it's a court, and the community is involved, the young people are engaged, the goal is to problem solve, the goal is not to arrest. Now people are brought to the court with criminal charges when there is an arrest. So really sort of looking at that, but then saying, how do you move that concept downstream? How do we ensure that people never reach the front door of any courthouse? And there are actually some really good programs right now that actually would do a whole lot better for developing relationships between communities of color and police, and in fact, perhaps provide this level of quote, quote, order, again, very vague term. That worries me because of the bias that you could read into that. But Cure Violence, the model I just talked about, is actually a model in which it started in Chicago that's actually focused on not just low level, it's gang intervention, gun prevention from a public health perspective. The police aren't involved in Cure Violence at all. It's community organizations, it's a public health model, so social workers, school systems. Here in New York City, the public defender, Legal Aid Society plays a vital role. And it is all driven by this notion that in order to reach young people who are in crisis, you probably should use not the police, you should use former people who were in crisis, who went through the system, who have now can come in and interrupt because they are role models for how you get out of that model. That's a hugely successful model. I'm going to credit NYPD in that they have a good program. It's a pilot right now. The Deputy Commissioner Susan Herman of NYPD sort of focused on Project Reset, which is a young person is arrested for a low-level offense, and they're given an opportunity before going to court on a desk appearance ticket. They can do sort of youth court or a session with the Center for Court Innovation, and if they successfully engage in a day or two of counseling or working with their community, they never have to, the case gets dismissed before it's even docketed in the court. It's dismissed. They never have to show to the court doors, right? What does that reinforce? One, it reinforces that young people have a shot. You don't have to get milled into the criminal justice system, because I will tell you, as somebody who's worked there for 14 years, once you're in, people know it's very hard once you have that first arrest to not pick up your second arrest. The other thing is about carefully enacting laws. So we just recently have a lawsuit right now challenging NYPD's discriminatory arrests, a little bit related to our prior panel, loitering for the purposes of prostitution. That's not prostitution, it's you're standing or you're dressed in a certain way and you're arrested for perhaps engaging in loitering for the purposes, not actual prostitution. The reason why NYPD is allowed to sort of use that to sweep up large populations of cis and trans women of color is because the statute is poorly defined, right? It literally can say based on the way you dress, or you're engaged in a passerby or in a car. So one of our plaintiffs was actually on her phone trying to hail a cab, she got swept up. Many of our trans clients, because police officers think that because they're dressed the way they're dressed and they're identifying a gender other than what the police like them to be, right? The police think it's a man, you should dress as a man, and are offended and have implicit bias. They get swept up because a black dress in East New York is a very different black dress than the woman who's standing hailing a cab in the Upper West Side. So how we script our laws helps this also, because what you will hear from police officers is, I'm following the law, right? Or I'm following the policy. So when you use vague terms like orderly, or you use vague terms like disorderly, and you don't have a strong definition to sort of gear what that might be, you then can allow bias to take over and have people define it as they see fit. So for me, a white woman in my neighborhood, if I wore a black dress, I wouldn't get busted, but somebody in Hunts Point might, or in an area in the Bronx might. So that's another way I think we could change our models to then address what is the real issues, which are the systemic problems that our communities face. Not to mention, much of this has to do with them, and I sort of take issue when we say that many of these people are not in jail and in probation. I'm going to tell you as a public defender, the reason why people are not in jail when they got swept up for misdemeanors is because they pled out at arraignments because they were afraid bail was going to get set. And then you just kept pleading every time you got arrested. You just pled out and you built up a criminal record. If we don't think, as a society, that the people, we have not done enormous damage by giving people criminal records on low-level misdemeanors so that they can't get jobs. Many of them had to get judgments on their surcharges, which means they can't get student loans because their credit is ruined. The fact that they had to do tons of community service, take time away to come to court, even if they didn't do a day at Rikers, the arrest and the plea are lifelong sentences that basically have disenfranchised hundreds of thousands of people of color because we thought that this was the right way to go to reduce violent crime. When what we probably knew was violent crime was getting reduced across the country automatically.
You have 3 minutes to respond, and then we're going to open it up to questions.
Okay, just on that last point about New York City is special when it comes to the precipitous and sustained nature of its crime decline. So Frank Zimmering, who's probably one of the foremost researchers when it comes to the crime decline, concluded that, in fact, the crime drop in the 1990s in New York City was more precipitous and statistically significantly more precipitous than the crime drop in cities nationwide. And he concludes with that crime drop that police were one of the primary reasons why those violent crime rates dropped. So again, we see police having a very real impact on not only the orderliness of communities, but also on violence, right? A robbery is a very serious crime. A murder is obviously one of the most serious crimes we have, right? And so when police are doing things, right, responding to this order, attending to community needs in ways that reduces people being robbed and people being killed, that's a real impact. And, you know, I think we're in agreement about the over-reliance on arrest, but I think that if you look at what is broken windows policing, it's police attending to disorder. And we know, you know, we say that this disorder is a nebulous term, but when you look at the research, we all, regardless of our socioeconomic background, regardless of our race, where we live, we know what disorder looks like, right? Condoms on the street, drug needles on the street, people in your face, not just sitting there with a tin asking for money, but in your face following you and harassing you. These are signs of physical and social disorder, right? Open air drug markets. To go back to the last panel, prostitutes trying to solicit business of men with their children. I don't think we could disagree that that is disorderly behavior and disorderly conditions. And time and again, as I cited in Boston and you know really across time, these are the major problems that are facing communities. And police, I think, are doing their best to respond to them. Certainly there are ways that we can improve policing, move away from the militarization of their tactics, and more importantly, in my opinion, their mindset, I think needs to change in terms of how they're tackling these problems. Giving police the analytical skills to problem solve the ways that we've discussed here. And I'll just cite one example from my own work in Los Angeles in Skid Row. So Skid Row is a 50-block square radius of concentrated violence, drug infestation, and disorder. It was a site of the LAPD's Safer City initiative. It combined $80 million of county money to put towards shelter, social service agencies, as well as police attention in that area to make sure that people can live there safely and more orderly. In my own observations there, I witnessed firsthand the lasting benefit of that initiative. The result of that is it resulted because then Chief Bratton, who you all know, worked with the ACLU, local businesses, and the mayor to come up with the constitutional parameters for the enforcement of minor offenses, with an eye towards meeting the needs of people living, working, and visiting that area. As a result, nuisance, violent, and property crime declined, and quality of life increased. There were still homeless persons living in Skid Row, but those who wanted to help had better access to help if they wanted it. And those who remained on the streets now lived with a greater peace of mind, more security, more order. Police targeted not individuals, but the environmental conditions, and they targeted behavior, violent and threatening behaviors, to restore order and maintain safety for all individuals living in that area. So again, I come back to this theme that I will grant you, police focus on arrest and citation for minor offenses has been counterproductive. However, I'm fearful that as a country, as we discuss reform in policing, that we move police away from their attention to disorder. Because again, they are the ones who time and again, through the history of policing in modern times, they've been the ones to respond and to be that face of government when all other agencies have failed. And so again, we could talk about the conditions that give rise to crime, and we all know that they exist. They've existed over time, and I think they'll continue to exist. And in the meantime, police have to respond. Police can't sit back and wait for our education system to reform. Police can't sit back and wait for individuals to get jobs who historically have been kept out of the employment market. And so as long as these problems are in our communities, it's the police who are going to be the ones to respond to those problems. And it's our job not to deny them the authority to respond to those problems, but to make sure that they can do so in a more constitutional and community-based way.
Okay, and with that, we're going to open it up to questions. I'm just going to bring the mic around.
You've been waiting.
Hi, Mr. Jenkins. I'm sorry I wasn't so kind to you. I was sitting right here. I have two questions. The first is, I heard you say broken windows is the nexus for the crime drop over the last 20 years in New York City, but that crime drop has also taken place in other cities across the country equally that have not implemented.
It's not been equal though.
I'm not done. And I was about to say, I heard you say that Zimmerman made some kind of demarcation between certain cities and the crime drop. What is the difference in that crime drop over the last 20 years between New York City and other metropolitan centers? Don't answer, I have another question.
We're gonna
and
start
then
with
my,
just one question.
and then my second question is, did I hear you say that prostitutes solicit men walking by with their children? Did I hear you say that this is one of the major issues facing metropolitan centers? Because I take issue as someone who is pent in traffic, never on the street, but did you say that really?
No. Let me just, your first question. So when we look at the reduction in violence, in violent crime, including homicide, robbery, sexual assault, we did see declines nationally in the 1990s, right? It's a great crime decline in the 1990s. But when you look at the numbers dropped more drastically in New York City, about 80% is kind of a safe general number, compared to about 65% in other cities. And Zimmering's research, again, he's the foremost researcher on crime declines, says that that was a statistically significant difference based on his analysis. So again, yes, crime did drop overall in the United States, but there's what we call an NYPD difference, and it's a result of police practice in New York City that contributed to greater reductions in, again, very serious crimes that I think we all agree are harmful to communities and to individuals and that are worth police attention. To your second point, no, I was not saying that that's a major problem for cities. I said that we would all agree that if that were occurring, that is a disorderly behavior, and that is detracting from the fabric of social life in a community. Maybe you'll disagree, but I think the research would show that we are in agreement about what is considered social and physical disorder, regardless of our race, and to say otherwise, I think, is almost infantilizing certain groups to say that they don't think that this is an issue.
So, interesting that you sort of talk about 1990. I think sort of 1990 was sort of a, interesting time. Again, I sort of heightened that you should all probably watch 13th because it sort of coincided with the war on drugs and sort of the sweeping up of major communities and the sort of reclassification of some crimes to sort of lower some rates and raise other rates. That being said, the DOI here in New York City and the Inspector General that is in charge of sort of monitoring the data on policing in June of 2016 did a study, and their goal was to sort of look at, does quality of life enforcement have measurable relationship to felony crime? And that showed from a 2010 to 2015, as the number of C summonses for low-level offenses, and arrests plummeted for misdemeanors, felony rates, crime rates went down as well. And so the statistics actually bear out. Perhaps in 1990 that might have been true, but right now, the fact is that you could actually stop broken windows and continue to see a decline in felony crime at the same time, which says to me, and I certainly see this playing out in court, that broken windows and sort of sweeping up massive people on quality of life had nothing to do. It happened to be a blip. The other thing it showed was at the same period of time, there was over 1,839,000 summonses issued, and when you looked at the areas in which those summonses sort of at the height of stop and frisk, the neighborhoods we were talking about were neighborhoods of color, right? Communities of color. So, but again, I sort of hearken that the 911 and 311 were all sort of what we would consider middle-class white neighborhoods. So it wasn't evenly distributed, this practice, and the statistics showed that you could actually not have sort of do this sweeping up and still have felony rate reduction, and it's still continuing actually to trend nationally down. While we'd all say right now that every police department has sort of looked at this and slowed down their quality of life enforcement given sort of the large amount of attention
that's been brought to it.
Other questions?
Could I add to that?
Yes, just.
The OIG report is interesting because a couple of points. First, there are some smart criminologists who looked at, David Weisberg is one of them, I'm drawing a blank on the other, who looked at the report and said that 5-year period was not probably the best level of analysis or chunk of time to look at when looking at the relationship between those summonses and crime. But that's besides the point, because again, I'm here because I want reform, right? And I'm here because I want the reform conversation to not focus broken windows policing on enforcement and citation. And I think to your point, you're absolutely right. In the 1990s, it was focused on enforcement, and it worked. And it worked. Times were different. We had the Clintons supporting tough measures on crime. We had all different representatives from all different communities saying, get tough on crime. And so the police were taking that lead, right? Again, they're representatives of the community. They're supposed to be in touch with the community and taking the pulse of the community. I completely agree that in 2016, the crime problem is different. Our societal framework is different for understanding the relationship to the police, and we do need to move away from enforcement, but it does not mean that police should not pay attention to disorder, which again is the focus of the 1982 article, that is that police should pay attention to disorderly conditions.
Other questions?
Thank you. Dr. Jenkins, why, as a professor and educator, because I myself, I'm a science teacher, why would you concentrate on a policy that has been proven time and time that is not working? I did read a report that has been done, I think, 15 or 20 years ago. It shows that policy really affects minority more than anything else, or race. Why is it that as an educator, instead of concentrating on improving education, helping people other ways, why would you concentrate on something that is not working? It's not, the policy has been proven that it's not working. It's affecting people's lives. People are dying as a consequences of those policies. And those policies that we are talking about, they are not serious crimes. This is not quality of life. Yes, it's important, but it's not as serious as somebody killing somebody else or stabbing somebody. So why, as a professor, as an educator, and you talk about fear, most of the time I'm thinking a lot of white people are dealing with fear. Is it fear that is so strong that is pushing you as an educator or professor to voice or speak on something that is not working, instead of concentrating, as the council says, helping people with their education, so improving their lives, or helping homelessness? Why is that? Is it really fear?
Well, I think that part of my argument rests on the idea that police can help in those areas. And again, moving away from this definition of broken windows policing as being one that focuses on arrests and citations. And so when they're moving away from arrests and citations, they're focusing on those signs of physical and social disorder and helping the communities the way that you're suggesting. And again, I would argue that if you look at the OIG report, if you look at pretty much all the research, while it might show racially biased outcomes in police interventions, even when it comes to the strict enforcement of those laws, or the definition of broken windows based on arrest or citation, you're also seeing that is where there's a concentration of violent crime. And so the individuals who are most benefiting from successful policing are the same individuals that you mentioned. So I mean, I'm sorry if there's a takeaway that I'm trying to support bad policy in terms of getting police to arrest more. I repeatedly have argued, or I meant to argue, that in fact, I don't think police should be making more arrests or writing more citations, but that they should still be paying attention to disorderly conditions, because they cut away at the fabric of life that help to prevent the more serious types of crimes that I think, again, we're all in agreement are issues.
Other questions in the back?
So for context, I worked,
Just wait for the.
the.
Yeah, so it just will help with the audio for the video that we're posting afterwards. That's.
Okay. So for context, I worked in homeless street outreach for 4 years in Washington DC, but I was employed by the private business improvement district in a very affluent area. So it was an interesting intersection. And they had a quality of life month every year where we watched the broken windows theory in practice. My question is, if you were to de-emphasize arrest and citation, but still practice broken windows, are you unfairly placing a burden on police officers to then also become social workers and teachers and educators and ambassadors for goodwill, et cetera, et cetera?
Without a doubt, that's a concern in terms of, it's going to mean that we change the ways that we select individuals in terms of the characteristics that they have. It means that we're going to train them differently in being able to do this. I mean, we see successful examples of this already, and I cited a bunch. But I think still, as I think many of you do, that there's still a focus on arrest, citation, and the authority of them to use force, right? And I think that is the problem with the way that police have been able to respond to those issues, is they're only using the tools that they know. And so, we need to expand police officer repertoire to include those other tools of interpersonal relationships, problem-solving skills, being able to organize individuals and groups to help meet the needs of communities that need help the most. Because again, it's not like we haven't had agencies trying to help these communities. We have, and these communities still have issues. And so I think police could play an important role in helping to mobilize residents and agencies to prevent serious problems from arising and to meet the needs that those communities have. So to answer your question, yes, it does place a different and probably a more expansive burden on police, but I think when you are, as a police officer, doing something that the community wants, and you're doing something more beneficial and not being seen as an outsider, not being seen as an oppressor, it's going to make your job a little bit more professional and a little bit more enjoyable.
Yeah, just let.
I think it's a burden, but more importantly, I think it's unrealistic. I think that means sort of a systemic, first of all, culture change that has to sweep through rank and file, senior managers. We can't even get the NYPD to fire the guy who violated to put Eric Garner in a prohibited chokehold. It was against policy. You can't even get them to fire that guy. And time again, the accountability and transparency of what is, like, in order to change culture, you have to then do that. You have to change culture, which means you have to fire the people that don't follow rules. You have to not pay people, overtime when they're actually suspended and because they killed somebody. So we don't have that. I mean, certainly not here in New York. Perhaps across the country there are some police departments that are willing to sort of do what the professor is suggesting. Here in New York, I can't get them. They're fighting in a lawsuit to give me Officer Panileo's substantiated CCRB complaints. The administration won't even do that. And so I have no faith that this is going to be the police force that's going to change the fundamental way in which it operates and become much more of a social work enforcement unit. Even the NYPD's own homeless outreach project, what we normally saw as public defenders is they were listed as the arresting officer who dragged the guy out of the subway. That was not what that unit was created to do. It was created to do what you did in DC, which was to actually proactively address homelessness at the root cause. They were just simply arresting people and ratcheting up the arrest numbers. So I don't have faith. I do think that if there was real systemic change, and real willingness to listen to the communities in which, right now, it's a patronizing approach, but to really listen and really engage, then there's some hope. But I'm not sure that we have that in this administration and leadership right now at this time.
I would just argue that, of course, reform is going to be hard, and it's not going to come easily because we are talking about some substantial reforms. But I think that's the purpose of why we're here, right? We want substantial reform, and as the quote says, the arc of moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think that if we want to elevate the policing profession to the image that I've presented today, it'll take work, it'll take time, there's going to be growing pains, and there's going to be obstinance on behalf of people who need to change, but I don't think it should keep us from instituting those necessary changes while keeping the core function of police alive.
We have time for one last question.
It's on. Oh, yeah, okay, thanks though. So I just have a question that I think both of you guys touched on, which is the quota system of policing. Can you explain to me what you think a better solution would be to that system and how you think it relates to this broken windows policy?
So NYPD has sort of denied over and over again that there was never a quota system. That's sort of high-ranking officers. There is officers that actually have gone on record to say, well, that's not true. I was told to go out and sweep all the homeless people in the park. So you might imagine that what you want as a, if you want as a police officer is to go into a community, get out of their patrol car, engage with the community, figure out if this is the model, right, the community policing model, engage with the community, find out what the issues are, and address them without arrest. Going out and sweeping up large populations, mostly of homeless people, for low-level citations shouldn't be their job. And in fact, many of them reported they didn't want that to be their job. That's not what they were recruited to do. That's not what they sort of set out to do. But what we would see is every so often at about 10:30 at night, NYPD's warrant squad would come in and literally chained together, shackled together would be 20 homeless men, and each of them had summons warrants, all for things like basically being homeless. Park after hours, drinking in public. They were homeless, they were sleeping on a park bench, and they'd have these warrants. And that was because there was a system that basically said, go out and write tickets, right? Because it would drive up the stats in law enforcement. We're doing good. We're responding to the 311, 911 calls. So they'd write a bunch of tickets to a guy they knew were never going to come to court because he doesn't have a Metro card to get on the train system. And by the way, if he begged to get on the train system from you or I, he's now arrested for unbelievable alienation against poor people, which is, as a poor person, you're not allowed to ask another person not jumping a turnstile. I'm not allowed to ask someone to swipe me in. That's a crime. If that's what you're sort of calling like what we now say is they're begging, and they're aggressively begging for somebody to swipe in. If that was a white person who left their wallet at home and didn't want to jump the turnstile, if I asked Nadia, then she swiped me in, she would, right?
I would.
I wouldn't get arrested for that, but the homeless black guy or Hispanic man does, or the kid does. So that's the type of sort of writing tickets for tickets' sake, which I think Mr. Jenkins agrees sort of is not the model by which you want any police force operating, but which by and large still in New York we arrest people for that type of stuff.
It's a great question. It really is the crux of a lot of these issues. And in my own research, it's been one of the things that police have said the most is that this seeming pressure to perform is what has driven a lot of the problems that we've discussed tonight. And so certainly quota system is ineffective in terms of getting the type of police work that we want. And we see this when we talk about differences between police outputs versus police outcomes, right? So police will write as many citations as they can, right? They'll make things up, they'll harass people. We've seen this, right? This is what we're, I think, talking about in terms of the dark side of over-enforcement. And so if we look at rather the outcomes of police work, then we're looking at not only were you active, right? Active can mean you wrote citations, it can mean you made arrests when necessary, it can mean that you interacted with kids out on the street in positive ways, that you stopped by businesses to make sure things were going okay. But also, what are the products then of your work? So are people satisfied with the police department? Do they think you have their best interests at hand? And so I think what we've seen is an emphasis on raising up those citations and those numbers, and we've separated that from the actual negative outcomes that have occurred. And so we've been okay with enforcement, completely neglecting the fact that people are feeling oppressed and people feel fearful of their police. And I think that's where reform needs to come in, is moving these systems of accountability and management away from a numbers-driven approach.
Okay, so thank you both so much. This has been a very enjoyable evening for myself and hopefully for our audience as well. We will do voting quickly and announce the results quickly, and then you can all be on your way to continue thinking about contentious criminal justice issues.